Early Saturday morning, a U.S. airstrike destroyed a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. And while the investigation is still ongoing, members of both Doctors Without Borders, which counted many of its members amongst those killed in the attack, and the UN Human Rights Commission say that if it is determined that this was intentional, it could very well rise to the level of a war crime. But first, I want to give you an impression of how devastating the death toll was from this. Now, Doctors Without Borders says 22 people were killed by the bombing, which Afghan officials now claim was in retaliation for fire from Taliban fighters hiding in the hospital. The president, Barack Obama, announced on Sunday he was launching a full investigation into the circumstances. Now, this is the narrative that has been put out by NATO, by U.S. forces, that the Taliban had been using the hospital location to attack their forces and their planes, and they struck the hospital in retaliation. But that seems very much up in the air at this point, whether that's actually true. Now, Christopher Stokes is the head of Doctors Without Borders. He says, not a single member of our staff reported any fighting inside the MSF hospital compound prior to the U.S. airstrike on Saturday morning. The hospital was full of MSF staff, patients, and their caretakers. It is 12 MSF staff members and 10 patients, including 3 children, who were killed in the attack. And so obviously many died. More than almost 40, I believe, were injured, 22 killed, at least as of this point, a large number of them being members of Doctors Without Borders. And the area, which already desperately was lacking in medicine and doctors, is now going to have even fewer because they were forced to flee as a result of the killings on Saturday. And to call into question perhaps even a little bit more the U.S. Sort of narrative of this, that the Taliban had been firing from that area, Christopher Stokes said that repeatedly and very precisely hit during each aerial raid, the hospital was, while the rest of the compound was left mostly untouched. And a nurse who is alive and went through the experience of the bombing on Saturday says that there had been firing very far away, but no firing nearby at the hospital before the bombing. Now, that doesn't mean that the U.S. did not still believe that there had been Taliban fighters there. They could have had the report from 8 hours before, a day before. And we do know that while Kunduz was taken on Monday of last week by the Taliban, leaving the Afghan government and U.S. forces on the outskirts at best around the airport, the counterattack by the Afghani government with support from the United States over the past few days has supposedly driven the Taliban out of most of that area. And now fighting is taking place only on the outskirts from the Taliban's point of view. Now, it's impossible to know exactly what's true coming out of that area because the Afghani government, of course, has a huge stake in controlling the message. They don't want to seem weak. They don't want the Taliban to seem like they have retaken over the area or come back into the sort of power that they had more than 14 years before. And so we do have to take with a grain of salt everything that we're hearing from that area. But as I said, if it turns out that this was actually intentional, that they knew that the Taliban wasn't there, although I have grave doubts about whether that would be the case, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, there will be an investigation into whether this was actually a war crime, and that allegation is coming from both Christopher Stokes and from the UN. But first, from Christopher Stokes, under the clear presumption that a war crime has been committed, MSF demands that a full and transparent investigation into the event be conducted by an independent international body. Relying only on an internal investigation by a party to the conflict would be wholly insufficient, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's incredibly unlikely that the U.S. would admit to any wrongdoing were they to find it out. That's the sort of information that we normally only get when people like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning releases it. And so, yes, there should be an independent investigation into the incident, particularly because of the high death toll. Now, the UN's human rights chief is Zayed Rad al-Hussein. He called for a full and transparent investigation, noting that, if established as deliberate in a court of law, an airstrike on a hospital may amount to a war crime. And I think that most people can agree to that. Do I believe that the U.S. intentionally struck a hospital that they knew was being used by Doctors Without Borders and was not being used by the Taliban? I don't believe so. Simply because I can't come up with any upside to doing so. They would know that that would be an absolutely devastating story. They knew that it would be reported. I mean, it's Doctors Without Borders. They know what they're doing in terms of being able to report the fact that more than 10 people in their staff had been killed. I would need to hear some sort of explanation as to what the U.S. was hoping to gain out of it if they were simply trying to kill doctors and knew that the Taliban was not using it. Now, if they thought that the Taliban was using it, but that the Doctors Without Borders was there, should they have fired on it? I would say probably not. I would have tried to take some other means of taking back the hospital if you honestly thought it was being used by the Taliban. But regardless of all these details, about what they thought they knew in there, or whether it was all of that, let's get out of there, out of Kunduz, out of Afghanistan. out of Syria, out of Iraq, out of all these areas. We have to talk about all of them every day. We don't need to be there. And think about if we had just gotten out a week earlier, these people would still have their lives. And in a week, what will happen if we stay? In a month, in a year, what will happen if we stay year after year after year? Now, if we leave, is that going to solve all the problems? No, of course it's not going to solve all the problems. There will be new problems. The situation overall might even end up being worse. But we have given it our best. Over 14 years, we have done absolutely terrible harm to that country. And almost every step of the way, we could have made drastically different decisions. Now, Bush obviously did not want to. He liked what was going on there. Barack Obama should have chosen differently. We should be out of there. We should not have been doing bombings exactly like this that are simply going to lead to more people like the Taliban, like ISIS, like all of these different groups operating throughout the region. It's an incredibly complex situation. You're talking about a very large area of the world in Afghanistan to Syria to Iraq. We're talking about a huge differences in geography, differences in culture, differences in religion that we clearly are not prepared to fix. We do not have the solutions. And so long as we're there and we don't have the solutions, but we are causing more problems, we need to get out. I think that Afghanistan would probably be better off. I think that we would certainly be better off. I think that we've been there far too long. We've done too much damage, and it's time for us to cut our losses and to cut the future losses that will be incurred if we stay and simply get out of Afghanistan.